North Korean troops in Russia. How do we understand Kim Jong-un's decision to support Vladimir Putin's war efforts beyond munitions and weapons to actual troops on the ground? Is this a new axis of comrades of arms in the making, or is this a mere mercenary cannon fodder for Russia? All this today in The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Thank you for once again joining us with The Impossible State. Today, joining us is Dr. Seth Jones. Seth is the director of the Defense and Security Department and Harold Brown Chair here at CSIS. He focuses on defense strategy, military operations, force posture, and irregular warfare. He leads a bipartisan team of over 50 resident staff, an extensive network of non-resident affiliates dedicated to providing independent strategic insights and policy solutions that shape nuclear national strategy. He also teaches at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Most importantly, and the driver for today's discussions, is his recent article in the Wall Street Journal entitled, North Korea Troops Become Cannon Fodder for Russia. And that will drive our conversation today. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Interesting subject, and it's an honor to be on. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Well, let's start off by discussing the article. The North Korean troops become cannon fodder for Russia. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of disinformation out there, a lot of speculation out there as well. Why this commentary and why now?
Well, I think there were a couple of reasons why the commentary at the time that we put it out. One was there had not been a lot of open source comments about the North Korean participation in the Russian war. And over the course of December and very early January, had the chance to sit down with, among others, Ukrainian forces that had been deployed to Kursk. So had firsthand experience and information coming from fighting against North Korean forces. So we had this combination of, the timing was good. There hadn't been a lot. The casualty numbers were frankly astonishing that it looked like North Korean soldiers were suffering. And then we had some primary source information. So all of that put together, when we reached out to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, they were really interested in the subject. Also because it provides a little bit of a pushback to what some have argued, that there is this sort of dire circumstance of growing cooperation between the Chinese, Russians, North Koreans, Iranians, which is concerning, as we'll discuss, but there are some weaknesses and vulnerabilities to the relations.
Well, that's interesting, and we can talk a lot about that, the whole axis theory, and whether we're seeing movement by these revisionist powers outside of or within some type of axis structure, or whether we have a number of bilateral relationships and we're just simply watching these relationships within this context of the axis. So your sense is we shouldn't read too much into this axis dimension as much as the bilateral cooperation that's ongoing.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it's not entirely clear. I mean, there are a range of incentives for these states to mask the kinds of aid they're providing. What it looks like are a couple of conclusions, I think, that we can come to. One is there has likely been an increase in cooperation, mostly bilateral and transactional, between these states, and there certainly has been an increase in cooperation likely since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some of that may be because the Russians are involved in a protracted war. Their industrial base was not, at the beginning of this war, fully prepared for a protracted conflict. And so they've needed assistance when it comes to everything from artillery to tanks to, once the sanctions hit, dual-use components, so think things like microprocessors and chips, components that are in the supply chain that go into radars and air defense systems. So there certainly has been an increase in cooperation at some levels, including the Russians and the Chinese. Those two leaders have met nearly 50 times. That to me suggests more than just a sort of tactical relationship. It's probably more than that. But I think what we don't see yet, or at least see much evidence for, is an alliance structure that is more than just bilateral and transactional. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but even between the Russians and North Koreans, it looks like the vast majority of the cooperation is bilateral right now, and we don't yet see any kind of full alliance between those states.
I see. So for those who don't follow it as closely as you have, what have we seen in terms of the types of munitions support, weapons support, and manpower support to the war effort that North Korea has been able to provide? And how might this change going forward?
Yes, that's really interesting. I will preface my remarks by highlighting what Karl von Clausewitz tells us about the fog of war. So there is in any war uncertainty and confusion. So I think trying to understand exactly what is going on is difficult, and I suspect over time we'll find out more detailed information. It has been helpful to some degree, not just to talk to individuals as we have that have been on the front lines fighting against North Korean forces, but also there's been a little bit of some primary source information that has come out. There have been at least 2 North Korean soldiers that have been captured. There's been stuff that they've had with them. So we've got a little bit of more primary source information. So here's what it looks like has happened. Interestingly, from as much as we can tell, it was actually the North Koreans that initiated the deployment of North Korean forces to Russia, not Vladimir Putin. So North Koreans proposed, and particularly Kim Jong-un proposed, sending North Korean troops to Russia to aid. We don't know a lot about what that discussion entailed, but what appears to be the case is that the North Koreans deployed somewhere in the vicinity of 11,000, 12,000 forces that deployed primarily to Russia and to the Kursk region of Russia, which is where the Ukrainians had conducted back in 2024 this interesting and surprising move, actually surprised Russian forces. Instead of fighting only in Ukraine, they surged across the Russian border, take an area that was not well defended by the Russians, and have held chunks of that territory in Kursk Oblast of Russia. So that's where North Korean forces were deployed recently, and we can talk more about this. It looks like those North Korean forces have largely disappeared from the front lines. By most accounts, and again, there's a fog of war, it appears from our conversations and from other conversations with Ukrainian forces that those North Korean forces that were deployed to the battlefield were fierce fighters, willing to fight and die, somewhat disorganized. The cohesion between North Korean and Russian forces, including command and control, was apparently poor. There were language barriers,
Right.
and so the casualty rates were significant. By most accounts that we were able to take a look at, somewhere between a third and probably on the real high end, maybe 50% casualties among the North Korean forces. Again, hard to know exactly what reality is, with as many as 1,000 killed. I mean, those are pretty staggering numbers of casualties for a force of 11 to 12,000. There's been some interesting stories on, very little food that they're carrying with them, little water, almost no cold weather gear, but lots of ammunition that they have to fight, and have been willing to die on the battlefield. So, that's kind of the tactical level North Korean deployment. in Russia as part of the Ukraine war. We also, there are indications that the North Koreans have provided other things in addition to soldiers, artillery rounds
Right.
like 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter, some howitzers and long-range multiple rocket launchers, short-range ballistic missiles, and other types of munitions that the North Koreans have provided to Russia. So this is part of a broader, again, bilateral package.
You know, it's interesting. You speak of the fog of war, and there's been a lot of uncertainty about the nature, the exact units that the North Koreans provided, and the nature and quality of these soldiers. I remember, I had served as the senior analyst back in 2016 to 2020 at U.S. Forces Korea, and we always, as you look at the North Korean Special Forces, you have, on the one hand, you know, a clear distinction between their capabilities and, for example, U.S. Special Forces, highly trained, well-equipped, highly motivated. But on the North Korean side, you know, just marginally better off than your average KPA soldier. These units, you know, the conscription is 10 years in North Korea, so you have that advantage of, even if they don't train at the same level that a U.S. soldier might train, they've got that unit cohesion. They're highly motivated. You know, but you mentioned in your article that they're being used in a way similar to Russian prison units, and I thought that was insightful. You know, and that tracks with your title, Cannon Fodder. Could you expand on that? What have you seen and watched what the North Koreans have come and done? And maybe not done, your assessment of their impact and value.
Yeah, what's interesting is 3 years into this war, Russian strategy, operations, and even some of their tactics, techniques, and procedures haven't changed dramatically. I mean, they've gotten better, for example, at some things. So their electronic warfare, Russian electronic warfare, and the use has improved. Same thing with things like unmanned aircraft systems, UAVs, or drones. But when it comes to how they actually fight, the Russian way of war, what we do see, actually it's the same thing with Russian prison units as it is with a number of Russian conventional units, is their way of retaking territory is to conduct attrition warfare and to take casualties and to accept those casualties instead of what a number of types of forces. So if you think the way of the joint warfighting concept in the U.S., the most recent version is 3.0. The core concept is how to maneuver in a contested environment. Well, that doesn't appear to be a major priority of the Russians. This is sort of straight attrition war. And what it means is it's you're sending forces into territory that is controlled by the Ukrainians, and you're sending waves of people in. Some of the forces that you're sending into areas to occupy buildings will be killed. Some of them won't be, but they'll occupy the buildings, and then they'll send another wave in. And that's the way that the Russians have been using North Korean forces. Even more elite units is to try to control territory that the Ukrainians have seized in Kursk Oblast, and these are strategies and operations that involve heavy casualties. From Vladimir Putin's perspective, it's okay. I mean, much of his conventional force is composed of individuals from Siberia, Central Asia, from prison units, not the sons of elite from St. Petersburg or Moscow. So the political costs aren't that strong, and we haven't seen it significantly impact his political support in Russia. Some cracks. That's the way it appears that the Russians have used North Korean forces. And even higher end forces. This is the Russian way of war. It is stunning in the high casualty component to it.
Do they have better trained, non-prison unit-like forces that are now freed up to engage in other battles on other fronts, or is Kursk the main game right now, and this is just the battle that we're seeing?
No, the primary areas actually for the Russians are in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. They're down in Ukraine. These are Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, not in Kursk. In fact, what appears to be the case is instead of mobilizing additional soldiers in Russia, which could have been politically costly for Vladimir Putin, bringing in North Korean soldiers and deploying them up to Russian territory that the Ukrainians controlled was a better option than a mobilization effort. No, this is not the primary effort. I think this was in lieu of mobilizing additional Russian forces. So the North Korean olive branch, so to speak, I think appears to be politically palatable for Russia. Although, again, it's unclear to what degree the North Korean leadership understood how they were going to be used and the impact of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm certain to some degree that the North Koreans have been tracking the developments on the battlefield in Russia through the various open source mechanisms. And if it's true that Kim Jong-un offered this to Vladimir Putin, then it had to be done within some type of study of how these forces might potentially be used. And it's even better, in terms of the way that the language in the treaty for strategic cooperation was written, that the justification by the letter of the treaty for North Korean troops usage would, of course, be on Russian soil, where the Russians had, been invaded, as seen from their own perspective. Overall, then, you think Vladimir Putin is satisfied, encouraged, disappointed, or none of the above in terms of the contributions versus the optics cost of the North Koreans' participation in this in the battle?
Yeah, hard to know exactly what is going on in the mind of whether it's Vladimir Putin or senior military leadership, including Gerasimov, for example. I think when you look at what has occurred in Ukrainian areas of Russia, areas like Kursk Oblast, which the Ukrainians at least partly control, the Russians and North Koreans have taken back some limited territory, but not a lot. Hard to see that. One clear positive aspect for Putin is that he has not needed to mobilize additional forces. Right. And I think that is a benefit. There are also, incidentally, some benefits, because I think there's an interesting question about why the North Korean leadership was willing to do this. What did they get in return? Again, there have been some open source reporting about the Russians either providing or potentially willing to provide technology for space, including satellites, right, nuclear-powered submarines, missiles, including ballistic missiles, cash, and then potentially oil. So there may be, and highly likely are a number of benefits that the North Koreans will get out of this relationship. Regardless, but again, not entirely clear what exactly the Russians are providing.
It's fascinating when you stop and think about it in terms of the evolution of our concerns about the relationship. And early on, I think, myself included, I was kind of inclined to see this as a transactional acts of desperation on both parts when you look at the initial contacts and the request for munitions, way before the idea of KPA troops going in, and even way before the treaty of strategic cooperation was concluded, that basically the Russians would give just the bare minimum necessary to meet their immediate needs of munitions and weapon systems. And as time went on, more and more people were concerned about the strategic dimensions of this and whether this represented an evolution in North Korea's diplomacy as well as Russia's, because there was an open, flagrant violation of all the United Nations Security Council sanctions on North Korea and Russia's role in the six-party talk structure of seeking the denuclearization of North Korea. This seemed to turn everything on its head, and so the question that we get all the time, in particular, is what will the future of this relationship be after there's a halt to hostilities, and will North Korea still be getting those same benefits, the satellite technology, even nuclear weapons technologies talked about, ISR capabilities so that their nuclear weapons are properly supported with good targeting, battle damage assessment, et cetera. So Putin's expectations, like you said, every one North Korean troop sent over there is one less that they have to mobilize. So based on your own experience, I mean, you've worked with special forces, doctrine, training. These storm troops, 10,000, maybe they're gone now, 11,000, maybe they're returning. What have they learned? Do you think that, the benefits to them, this is a 1 million-man Korean People's Army force, the idea that 10,000 people engaged in door-to-door brunt combat, bringing back any lessons of modern warfare is really a stretch. But what's your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think if one goes back to warfare, the nature of war generally doesn't change much. It's still brutish, violent, but the character of war evolves. And one thing that the North Koreans don't have is a recent experience in high-end combat.
Right.
So I think, participating in war, even in Kursk, does provide the soldiers, general officers, and the North Korean military a bit more close-up understanding of how war, the character of war, has evolved. So one can see, how do you conduct combined arms operations? There has been, the Russians generally do this poorly, but there's still a need to coordinate to some degree between dismounted infantry, between artillery, fire, maybe air power, cruise missiles, although Russians aren't particularly good at joint operations, but the use of drones, UASs, which is a relatively new development on the battlefield, the way they're being used now. When I was in government, most of the drones we used, like MQ-9s, were primarily for strike, or for the way we used them primarily was intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of potential targets, or just intelligence collection more broadly. Now they're used for help in spotting, including for artillery, battle damage assessment, psychological operations, electronic warfare. It can be used for counter UAS, counter drone defense. So there are a whole range of ways. Electronic warfare in this new changing character of war is evolving. The Russians are pretty good at that. So what can the North Koreans learn from the way EW, electronic warfare, is used on the battlefield? And just understanding the speed with which this is changing. I mean, the Ukrainians tell us that many of their tactics, techniques, and procedures are frequencies for communication, or how they move information along various frequencies, are the types of electronic warfare that are successful. It changes from day to day, week to week, month to month. So they have to be adaptive. So try to understand that. Lots of other things that the North Koreans could learn on fire suppression, command and control, just the broader kill chain. How do you take information that's, let's say, pulled from a drone operating above the battlefield, moving it back, sharing that back with artillery so that it can strike? The Russians call it a reconnaissance strike complex. That can be quite useful if the North Koreans improve their ability to do what the U.S. again calls a kill chain. And then lots of other things. Defense industrial base. How do you improve your defense industrial base for protracted war? So if the North Koreans are thinking about a protracted war with South Korea. What is that? What are the stresses on the industrial base? What are the types of munitions that end up being useful? And then also things like information and psychological operations that are important, and they're used on both sides of the lines in the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, look, there are a whole range of things in this changing character of war that the North Koreans certainly could learn from participation that's going to be different if they're just monitoring this from back in North Korea.
Right. So, on the drone piece, what we've seen primarily is how the North Koreans have learned to respond to an adversary that's actively using drones, or do you believe that the North Koreans have been involved in drone use themselves, that they've learned techniques for offensive drone operations?
Well, it's unclear to what degree they have actually used drones themselves. What it does appear to be the case is that in areas where North Korean forces are being used, there are drones that the Russians, or it's possible that the North Koreans, but that are being used on the Russian side. It may be the Russians using those drones. Again, the Russian way of warfare that we're seeing is high casualty and essentially waves. And just to give one a sense of the casualty figures, what we're seeing is something along the lines of upwards of 700,000 to 800,000 casualties, according to U.S. estimates, since the war began, which is stunning.
Wow.
It's just what the Russians are suffering, 3 times the number from all Russian and Soviet wars combined between World War II and the beginning of February 2022 when the war began. This is how the Russians fight wars, heavy casualty. So that's what the North Koreans have inserted themselves into. Most of what the Ukrainians are reporting, and as we've talked to the Ukrainians, are dismounted infantry, not drone use, not it doesn't appear that they're making extensive use of armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles, but they're mostly infantry. Nevertheless, what's not clear is what are they learning behind the lines? Mm-hmm. Are they communicating as they train with Russian forces? Are they picking up helpful information on tactics, techniques, and procedures, or operational level? Are they learning operational lessons from the Russians on some of these other types of war? And that is, again, less clear, certainly possible, though. Yeah,
this seems like a big homework assignment for analysts here and in Seoul and elsewhere, because I think if you look at the past 30-year history of the nuclear missile development program of North Korea, it's also the same 30 years that the Korean People's Army that was so robust that, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s begins to atrophy as it loses support and aid from benefactors in the post-Cold War era. So there's Soviet-era equipment's not being maintained or modernized. It's really the conventional force is a weakened fighting force, even as the North Korean WMD program grows. And I think the one area that most analysts need to be concerned about is when North Korea has a more credible conventional capability that is the result from Russian assistance and aid that they've promised as part of this current support of North Korea to Russia, that is better armed and supplied through a munitions industry base that's been revived through Russian support, even though it's been revived primarily to support Russian efforts. It's a longer-term capability that the South Koreans will have. And if these troops come back and say, because Kursk isn't Seoul, but this is your kind of same, your wave-type tactics, moving from building to building, tactical, short-range ballistic missiles, coupled with ground troops, conventional troops on the ground, is a type of conflict that we're most afraid about in in Korea. Now, North Korea hasn't sought to unify the peninsula since the armistice was concluded in 1953, but it is the scenario that we worry about going forward. And, part of it, hopefully the lesson going back to Kim Jong-un from the experience of these stormtroops is, this is a mess, we're not prepared for it. The other one might be, we can do it. We've learned how to do it. We've learned how to engage in all those types of warfare you mentioned, and they might feel empowered on the one hand and emboldened on the other. And this is a scenario we worry about.
Yeah, two interesting comments along the lines here is the South Koreans, based on press accounts, have been working closely with the Ukrainians on what the North Koreans are up to in Russia and fighting in the war. And it has, I'm sure, been helpful to have at least two, and we'll see if the North Koreans reappear at the battlefield, whether they have more individuals captured. Right. Because at that point, then the South Koreans can interrogate those individuals. What were they doing? Tell us about what you were learning. What did the training look like? What's the purpose of it? What did you know? That can be useful for the South Koreans in better understanding when they have people that are captured, and in a few cases also that the Ukrainians have been able to get Korean forces that have been killed on the battlefield, but they have pocket litter on them. They have other things that will be useful from an intelligence perspective. The other thing that's interesting from a Korean Peninsula perspective is to what degree, if there were a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, now would we suspect that the Russians would provide assistance to North Korea? And this is where these broader relationships are interesting, because I think if you had asked me in February of 2022 whether we would see this, what we're seeing today, the Iranians not just providing Shaheeds, these are drones, Shaheed 136s and other types of aid to Russia, but also building them, building factories so they can produce them in Russia itself. The same thing with the North Koreans and the Chinese, that the weapons flows can go in multiple different directions, and aid can go in multiple different directions. So to what degree, if there is war, would the Russians provide badly needed munitions, help, technology, or other assistance in the Korean Peninsula? It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the Cold War history, and it wasn't your kind of like U.S. hub and spoke relationships between the United States and its allies, but there were this dynamic of Moscow, Beijing, Moscow, Pyongyang, Pyongyang, Beijing relationships. And during that period, it was both, particularly in Russia and Soviet Union's interest to not let North Korea adventurism on the peninsula, entangle them, that classic entanglement fear. And there was, always that struggle by both Beijing and Moscow to have the sufficient leverage over Pyongyang to discourage it from such behavior that would be detrimental to their own security interests. So, in light of the treaty, and in light of the types of support, from troops to munitions to artillery pieces that the North has provided Russia, would Russia provide such support reciprocally if North Korea could make the case that just as Russia had been invaded, that it had been invaded by a force, South Korea, backed by a nuclear power, the United States, and therefore have some degree of confidence that Russia would support its efforts? That's something I think that, we can speculate now. We really won't know until the actual situation develops.
Yeah, hopefully we won't know.
And so the other interesting variable in all this, of course, is the advent of the Donald Trump Term 2 administration and what the president has articulated in terms of his objectives to try to bring an end to the war on the ground, his intent to engage Kim Jong-un and try to seek some forward progress on the denuclearization front, on the U.S.-DPRK relations. What's your sense about what Donald Trump is going to try to do in terms of Ukraine right now, and what about the DPRK piece of the Russian war effort? Would that be included? What type of approaches are you kind of watching for from the new administration?
Well, I think the most important initiative is the indications that General Kellogg, on behalf of President Trump, is involved in the early stages of setting down some kind of negotiation to end the war. I think it's unlikely the war is going to end in some capacity. We might get a ceasefire that comes out of it. I think the big challenge for the U.S., the Europeans, and others involved in pushing for negotiations of whatever end, whether it's to actually end the war or to at least have some kind of a temporary ceasefire, is that both the Russians and Ukrainians are far apart right now at the bargaining table. The Russians are pushing for Zelensky essentially to step down, no NATO membership, and essentially a militarily neutered Ukraine. Ukraine is, and the Russians want at least all the territory they've conquered. If you believe what Putin has already said about Ukraine, which is that he believes that Ukraine is Russian territory, that would suggest that this is not over for him, even if there's a ceasefire. And the Ukrainians they're generally bargaining strategies almost entirely the opposite, which is they want NATO membership. I don't think they'll get it under a Trump administration, but they want to claw back as much territory as they can get that the Russians have taken since 2013, not just since the 2013 and 2014, not just since the war began the full-scale war began in 2022. They also want as many weapons as they can to deter any kind of conventional Russian action again in the future. So, lots of conventional stockpiles, air defense systems, long-range strike, aircraft that can fire cruise missiles. And, I mean, that's what they want to deter in the future. I think it's going to be very hard to negotiate an actual end to this war. And as for the way the Trump administration might look at the DPRK involvement, again, that's not entirely clear right now. The president hasn't made any statements. I don't think I've heard any of his senior officials, whether it's Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of State, say anything about this. What is interesting, though, is that there are some fissures among this, pick your term, axis of autocracies or axis of, some call it a Legion of Doom, to use the DC Marvel terminology. There have been some interesting setbacks. We saw the collapse of the Assad regime, which is an ally of both the Russians and the Iranians. We've seen the weakening of Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah was an ally of both the Russians and the Iranians during the wars in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And now we've got the North Koreans suffering extraordinary casualties in Russia itself. There are some weaknesses. Will they try to take advantage of some of these, of potential fissures, try and exploit for information or psychological, have an impact? It's not clear why the North Koreans have taken the forces off the front line. Is it actually because the casualties have been high, or is it because the casualties have been reported publicly so high? Everybody knows now that that it's not just that the North Koreans have fought, but everybody knows now that they've suffered extraordinarily. So how much of this is to keep providing public information about some areas and potential fissures? Because it does appear to be that there do appear to be some potential fissures. The North Korean, by most accounts, from what we're hearing from the Ukrainians, have been given relatively like few armored vehicles, for example, to get to the front lines, which is different from some Russian forces.
Right.
So I know are there some fissures? We'll see to what degree the Trump administration tries to open up fissures along these lines.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think about the pre-election comments made by a number of people, some of whom are actually going to be part of the Trump team, others who were supporters of Trump. But the calls for the U.S. to diminish and reduce our support to Ukraine and turn our focus away from that battle to China. To Asia, the true long-awaited pivot to China, to Asia, with China being a much greater threat to U.S. security. So I just kind of wonder if there's a way that the U.S. kind of, independent of whether a ceasefire is negotiated between of some type between Russia and Ukraine, whether we just simply walk away from the issue. Do we have that luxury to just diminish the attention that the United States pays to this? Let Russia and Ukraine fight it out. Europe can participate as it wishes, and turn to what is being characterized as the next big security concern, that being of China, and that would also be related to kind of your sense you mentioned earlier about the need to maybe downplay the significance of Axis or Axis-centric behavior. And my question to you, in addition to commenting on anything I just said, would be, how does Donald Trump view the Axis per se? Is it something? Does he worry about the Axis? Does he worry about individual countries within the Axis? Is he focusing how to undermine the narrative that the U.S. is in decline and the emergence of an alternative world order led by countries like China, like Russia, is appealing to a growing number of countries? Is he going to actively seek to counter that? And how does he balance that with cutting overseas aid, questioning U.S. troop presence abroad, et cetera, all these things that would seem to point away from the U.S. that wants to be actively involved in geopolitical issues?
Yeah, so a few things. One is, I have spoken with some current administration officials about one aspect of the war in Ukraine that is interesting. I think, as you note, that China is the priority, and I think that was the President Trump said that during the campaign. At the same time, though, a collapse of the Ukrainian state, if Ukrainian lines were to collapse because of an end of U.S. assistance, and if the Europeans couldn't significantly increase what the Ukrainians needed, there's also a morale effect if there was no additional supplemental. That I don't think that's what the Trump administration wants. They are very cognizant of the first year of the Biden administration, the collapse of the Afghan government, and this would be a real serious public relations blow, I think, to the administration to have a Ukraine collapse. So I don't think they want that outcome. Second, what is interesting is I think it has become increasingly difficult to bifurcate some of these regions. So you can talk about China first, but I think when you do see countries collaborating, I think it's hard to do this in isolation. And it's certainly interesting when you look at Chinese assistance to the Russians. They've provided a ton of aid that the Russians are using to prosecute the war, from semiconductors and microelectronics to precision machine tools to drones. They've got Chinese have contractors on the ground for some of the in Russia for some of the weapon systems that they use, titanium and magnesium alloys. A whole stuff for explosives. Chinese have provided a lot. So there is a level of intertwining, at least bilaterally, between these countries that I think it's going to make it difficult. In fact, The last two national defense strategies have really been focused on China, both the first Trump one and the Biden one. I think increasingly the U.S. has a multi-theater problem, not just a China one. So that is an issue. I think what we're already seeing in the early stages of the Trump administration, though, is when it comes to tools, a preference right now for economic tools, which does suggest that if the Russians aren't really willing to cut a deal that is something that either the U.S. or the Ukrainians can live with, that the first instinct may be less ramping up on military assistance to the Ukrainians and more ramping up on sanctions to the Russians. In fact, President Trump has already indicated something along these lines if Putin is not willing to negotiate. So I think what we're seeing is more a sanctions tool than a military tool. I do think the challenge that the administration is going to have to think through, though, is with some of these relationships between whether it's the North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians and the Russians, is that the U.S. needs allies and partners.
Right.
And that would be a real serious consequence is if the U.S. suddenly takes a transactional approach to some of its allies in ways that undermines what's going to be really important to have allies and partners in the future. So that's one last area I'm going to keep an eye on.
Right, because it's going to be the broader economic, tariff, trade policy and strategy that will come up against this idea of sanctions and how we work internationally to punish adversaries and try to encourage good behavior. But you can't do that without allies. Otherwise, there's just too many workarounds. So you can't have it both ways. We've run out of time. Thank you so very, Seth. Thank you so much. We could go on and on. I think there's a lot of developments that are uncertain. We'll see whether those 10, 11,000 troops are replaced, whether this is a permanent stand down. Kim Jong-un saw how they were being misused or ineffective or shedding a little bit too much more blood than he thought he was willing to accept, or whether this is the beginning of a troop rotation of its own kind. Thank you for your attention to this, and look forward to working and talking with you in the future on these issues. That's all for today's Impossible State. Thank you all for tuning in.